You are listening to the Down the Wormhole podcast, exploring the strange and fascinating relationship between science and religion. This week, our hosts are Zack Jackson, UCC pastor in Reading, Pennsylvania, and I am most productive when everyone else is asleep at night.
Ian Benz, associate professor of elementary science education at UNC Charlotte. My most productive time of the day sadly varies because of my ADD. I cannot pick a particular time and say, that's it. It just, it happens. And when it does, I get really frustrated if people get me out of that moment because it takes hours to get into it. So, yeah.
Kendra Holt-Moore, assistant professor of religion at Bethany College in Lindsborg, Kansas. And I used to be able to say I was most productive at night because I am a night owl, but the older I get, the more that varies. And I also don't feel like there is a particular time that works best. You just let the spirit lead.
Just tired all the time.
Yeah. Constant exhaustion and just snippets of bursts of energy. So, why, you ask? Are we talking about time?
Yes, tell us.
I was asking it very hard in my head. Thank you for
Zack
anticipating that. Why? Why, Kendra? Answer why. Why are we talking about time?
Why ever?
Why ever?
Well, let me tell you. I have an answer for you.
Oh, thank God.
We thought that today we would talk about shapes of time. Ooh, spooky. So shapes of time. So just to kind of start out. So whenever I teach students, typically it's in like a world religions or an intro to religion class. This semester it was a world religions class. But when I'm having a conversation in a classroom with students about different, religious traditions and how, like, what are some of the things that we can compare safely without sort of essentializing religious traditions. One fun conversation I like to start with somewhere near the beginning of the semester is to talk about shapes of time. And what I mean by that is, cyclical versus linear conceptions of time. Or, some might argue also like spiral shapes of time. And so the way this looks when I bring it up to my students is I typically use for my examples Hinduism or Buddhism and Christianity. And I draw up on the board just, a simple like circle and a simple like horizontal line as just like two examples of shapes, this circle and this horizontal line. And I talk about how, time is something that we sort of take for granted as it's just sort of, it permeates everything, but we're not always like thinking about how our understanding of time, like really impacts us necessarily, or maybe I shouldn't speak for y'all, but I don't always think about how time itself is like impacting my day to day, except when I'm trying very hard to get something done and time is just slipping away. That is a moment where I become very conscious of time. But on a grand scale, it's something that's sort of taken as just the way things are, and the way that we think about time is, I think it's easy to sort of assume that our sort of grand notions of time and how time unfolds, that there's nothing too complicated or like interesting about that necessarily. And so when I draw up this like circle and line on the board for my students, one of the conversations that I'm trying to get started is how we, across like religious and cultural traditions, we actually have very different understandings of time. And by time, I'm not talking in this moment necessarily about like scientific, like theory of relativity, kind of technical explanations of like space-time, but like cultural and social understandings of like what will happen, what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen to us socially and culturally. And so the circle on the board then is what I offer as like a Hindu or Buddhist example of cycles of time with regards to reincarnation and how, the human soul, if we're talking about Hinduism, but not really a soul if we're talking about Buddhism, but the person and the person's existence moves through a cycle of time that is stuck in this cycle of reincarnation, of birth, life, death, rebirth, and that this is this circle is known as samsara. If you're using Hindu terminology and conceptions of time, and samsara is a cycle that you want to get out of. So samsara is like the way things are from a Hindu or Buddhist perspective in terms of thinking about time and how we exist in time. But samsara is not desirable. There are ways that you can build up better karma and be reincarnated in a way that is better or worse, contingent upon like what kind of karma you built in your current life. But ultimately, the goal in that version of cyclical time is to get out of the cycle, to be released from this cycle. But the cycle can go on and on and on, and you can have, hundreds of reincarnations, and there's no, like, you have to, there are certain practices and things you have to do in order to be released from this cycle. And so, one of the, we can put this in the show notes, but there's an article that has like some helpful kind of visuals, but I want to just kind of talk about like the way that this cycle of time for Buddhism is represented. It's the Buddhist wheel of life. And there are a lot of different, if you just Google that, like you'll find all kinds of really colorful, vibrant images that come up of this wheel of life. But the wheel of life, you can see like there are different realms in the Buddhist wheel of life. And those are sort of the possibilities for how you reincarnate into the cycle of samsara. And so you can see like why now, hopefully, like there's this distinction between like cycle versus linear time, because there's not like one specific end goal that is clear to you from the perspective of your current life. If you have this cyclical notion of time, yes, like ultimate release from it, you could see that as an end goal. But like the reincarnation cycle, it means that you will again experience what you have already experienced. You will again experience birth, which is something that you already have experienced in the past. You will again experience, life insofar as you have experienced it. And, death will happen again and again and again. It's not a single kind of destination point until you have achieved the right tools and practices to get out of that cycle. And so you can kind of think about like how that might inform a person to like navigate through life itself. The linear line on the board I use as Christianity, but I think it also applies pretty well to like the Abrahamic traditions in general of Judaism, Christianity, Islam. But I use Christianity in particular because there's so much that has been written about Christian, like apocalyptic, eschatology, which is a fancy word meaning like the study of end things or, like end of time. And another, there are some images that we can also share, I think, in the show notes of this version of Christian eschatology called Christian dispensationalism. there are different ways to kind of label this too. Like you may have heard Christian premillennial dispensationalism, postmillennial dispensationalism. However you slice it, it is a mouthful of a thing to say, dispensationalism. Yeah. But there are images that we can share that kind of show that in this version of Christian eschatology, it's not how everyone sees the end of time, but this version of Christian eschatology that's popular in especially some circles of like Christian like fundamentalism types of theology, or like some evangelical theologies. There are 7 dispensations of time, and that time moves in a linear fashion, and a dispensation is just like a stage of time. I think that's the way I would describe it more simply, because dispensation is also kind of a buzzy word in this context. But there are like stages of time that kind of unfold in this linear fashion. But the point is that we're not moving in a cycle with this conception of time. We're moving towards an end point that is the apocalyptic end of time. And after the end of time, eternity unfolds forever and ever. And it just kind of goes on in this linear, like one way. There's a path, a direction, and we move in that direction. And it's kind of inevitable. Like you can't really stop it from unfolding. It's going to happen. And, some of these dispensations for Christian dispensationalism, you have like the age of innocence. And that's like, Adam and Eve. You go up through like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But I could like list all of those, but I'm side note trying to kind of move quickly. I'm timing myself this time so that I'm not going like way over 15 minutes.
So it's like innocence, no innocence. God's here, God's there. Now it's Israel. Now it's Jesus. Now it's yeah. It's also inherently kind of anti-Semitic. In that dispensationalism leaves Jews behind. But go on.
Right. So, you have like innocence, stage 1, stage 2, conscience, stage 3, human government, stage 4, promise, stage 5, law, stage 6, grace, stage 7, kingdom age. And there are, specific things that happen in each of those stages that kind of map on to biblical stories. The stages that map on to like the time of Moses and, just like the time of Abraham, in all of these stages as they unfold, it's like sort of this like progression of like God's plan for time. And the way that ends is with this 7th dispensation, the kingdom age, where Jesus returns and reigns on earth for 1,000 years and, brings peace. And, after that time is kind of over, there's like the final judgment, the white throne judgment, and then time ends and eternity begins. And that's kind of the ending of this like premillennial dispensationalist Christian theology. Again, sorry for the long, buzzy terminology. But the point is that this version of time is different. Like it has that linear shape to it. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about this understanding of time, and there's this like piece of inevitability, and it's not the only version of like this is, I think, kind of a common kind of trope in like apocalyptic literature and thought is like the apocalypse is coming eventually, like it's inevitable. And that means that you can't fight it. And in some ways, believing in the inevitability of the apocalyptic moment of end of time can make some people sort of lean into that and welcome that end of time moment if it means that their sort of conception of time will actually like ultimately benefit them. So, for example, in like this Christian dispensationalist premillennialism version of the end of time, Christians who hold this believe that they'll be gone. They'll be sort of taken away by God out of out of the earth, out of time, so that they don't have to experience the violence and trauma of the apocalypse itself, and that they will be, held close, near and dear and safe with God and protected from the end of times. And so what this means is you have Christians who hold to this kind of eschatology are, I think, more likely to say things like, well, let's just let it all burn because we're not going to be here anyway. Only the unsaved will be sort of judged and condemned, but, Christians will be safe. So any violence that happens, ultimately, it's not going to affect us in the end in this kind of eternal way. And so I think the kind of extreme response through that kind of lens of time is it can, doesn't always have to, but it can lend itself to apathy and even a condoning of destruction and violence. And this is sort of using that as an example because there was actually an article that was published very recently in the Atlantic about this language, cautioning against the language of a new civil war that's impending in the United States. And that the whole article is pretty interesting, but there's this line that caught my eye. And it says, several paragraphs down, and I'll just kind of read the couple of sentences for y'all that says, quote, "There is a very deep strain of apocalyptic fantasy in fundamentalist Christianity. Armageddon may be horrible, but it is not to be feared because it will be the harbinger of eternal bliss for the elect and eternal damnation for their foes. On what used to be referred to as the far right, but perhaps should now simply be called the armed wing of the Republican Party, the imminence of civil war is a given," end quote. And that caught my eye because it's really talking about a shape of time. And, the question that kind of arises from that for me is what are practical implications in our behavior when we think about what our own shapes of time are? Do we have notions that lead us to an inevitable end? Is it something that we experience over and over again? And is that just sort of philosophy or theological pondering, or does that kind of impact us on this deep on the ground level? And so that was kind of where my mind was going when I think about this shape of time. So that's kind of what I have to start us here.
No, well, so as while you were talking about it, especially the last part, and I mean, y'all know I don't have the theological background that you guys do, so a lot of times the words that are used, I'm kind of what are you talking about? But it made me just all of a sudden just reminded me of the Left Behind series.
Yes.
That was written, the book series, right? And so
that is a great example, Ian, that you have just given us and reminded us that is Christian premillennial dispensationalism.
Yeah, so now
that's
I'm
a good translation, aka Left Behind series.
Right. Well, and I find it fascinating. So what's interesting is that I actually got into reading this series in 2000. It was when I was in the Peace Corps. And so when I was in the Peace Corps in Jamaica, and the main office in Kingston, I always had a library that we could go and just get books from and blah, 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 and take with us back to our home and everything. And so I think that was the time I started getting into this series because I saw it and I was kind of oh, that sounds kind of interesting. And so I started reading it. And I, was not very strong on my faith. I want to take that back. That's actually when I first started a Bible study, but it was a different time in my life, right? So I was 23 years old, 22, 23, different time in my life, different things going on. Now that I looked it up and just looked up Left Behind again to remind myself some of it. And I'll be honest, I did not finish the series because I found it to be, and this is just my opinion, some of the writing, again, I was not familiar with the language, the terminology that was being used, and the description that you just provided, Kendra. But there were parts of the books I found as I was going further and further in the series that I would skip whole sections because it felt like it was reading the same thing I read in the book before, right? Like these long sermons from a character or whatever. And so, I'm curious, how would I approach the series now at this point in my life and at this point in my spiritual journey, right? And starting to have a better understanding of time and just religion in general and what the underlying meaning. I mean, I get what the meaning was, but like, talk about what is the word again?
Dispensationalism.
There you go. That word.
You can approach that book series straight into the recycling bin if you'd like.
Yeah, I don't think we have them anymore. I ended up
good.
buying several of them and got rid of them.
That's good. Yes, pre-trib, premillennial dispensationalism is what that is.
Okay.
Essentially, the millennial in the premillennial, postmillennial, midmillennial, that has to do with, in Revelation, talks about how there will be 1,000-year reign of Christ. Before then, Satan is allowed to return, cause havoc, and then the final judgment. And so then the question is, when does that happen? So the premillennial is that hasn't happened yet, and that there will be this great time, and then there'll be blah, blah, blah. Then there's postmillennial that's like, hey, no, that's where we are right now, that this kingdom age is the millennial reign of Christ, that the age of the church, or maybe that we're almost there. And then the trib part of that is Great Tribulation.
And trib as in tribulation.
Right. The 7-year tribulation that is foretold in Daniel and in Revelation. And at what point would the people of God be raptured out of it so that only the unrighteous should suffer? There's some interpretations that, before the tribulation, all the elect will be taken out, and that's what left behind is. There's some thought that it's midway through, taken from a couple of phrases from Daniel. And then there's some that everyone will have to live through the whole thing, only until the end will then there be judgment on it all. And I mean, I was steeped in this stuff. My 7th grade Bible teacher had a timeline on the wall of the end times, with like how many months in between events would happen. You know, the 2 witnesses would show up here, one of them would die, and then they'd raise, and then there'd be, the Antichrist would rise, and he would have a mortal wound, and then he'd be healed, and then he'd be like all along the way. We knew what the mark of the beast was going to be and when it was going to happen. It was actually supposed to start happening on Y2K, but then apparently enough people prayed and God delayed God's hand. Or so that's what they told me when it didn't happen. But it's ironic to me that this group of people has latched onto Second Temple apocalyptic literature, which is this period of time. It's like a 300-year period during the Second Temple of Jerusalem where this genre starts to arise. They've taken that and applied it directly to this sort of straight line timeline that you're talking about, Kendra, that this thing hasn't happened yet, but here are the signs to know when it's going to happen and what it's going to look like. And it goes from A to B to C to D onward until the end. And it's a straight line. When that is the exact opposite of the way that Second Temple apocalyptic literature is written and meant to be read. If you look at Daniel and parts of Jesus's little apocalypse on the mountain and the book of Revelation and all of the ones that didn't make it into the Hebrew and Christian canons, they're all using coded language for things that are happening in the moment. Now, there's a great part in Daniel in which they're talking about kings of the north and kings of the south and marriages that between them and wars between them. And it's very clearly talking about the battles between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And like historically, we know this. This is lining up exactly what it is until the desolation of the abomination of desolation. And then there's this great war. And then God comes down with his angels and saves the day, which we know didn't happen, at least not in any kind of final sort of a way. So then what do you do with that? Well, that's how all of them are written. They're all written with this great symbolism of things, of awful apocalyptic sort of images. And in the end, God wins. And I say apocalyptic, that word means to reveal, to pull back the curtain. And so what that whole genre is doing is it says, hey, you see these things happening in real life, but I'm going to pull back the curtain and show you the spiritual realities behind them. So you think Rome is this unstoppable force, but hey, pull back the curtain and it's actually just this ugly dragon. And the ugly dragon is going to be thrown into the pit of fire. So these books were meant to be read by people who are currently suffering so that they can put themselves in the story and then see that in the end, God rescues them. So in a way, Second Temple apocalyptic literature is like a green screen in which generation upon generation upon generation can stand in front of it and put themselves in the story. So the beast from Revelation is originally Nero, and then it might be Domitian, and then it might be Valerian, and then it might be Stalin. Like you can make the beast any number of things, as it has been. I mean, Martin Luther said that was the Pope at one point. And, for all intents and purposes, for him it was, because that's the point, is these prophetic visions are cycles of things that they're true because they keep happening. And then the point is you get to put yourself in it, and then you get to see that God is faithful and that you'll be brought through it at the end. And so to take that kind of genre of literature and then to take that circle, that spiral, and to just stretch it out and say, all right, this is what it means. This is the start and the end of the end times, is just, it's so dishonest and disingenuous, and it does violence to the scriptures themselves.
It also sounds a little bit like, I don't know if you necessarily intended it this way, Zach, but like it seems like people, when they're in the moment, especially with this like genre of like apocalyptic literature, being in it, those like apocalyptic tropes, like it feels linear because it's like the cycle that you are experiencing, but you don't see it as a cycle. And, obviously, like we've kind of used the premillennial Left Behind type eschatology as that, but like it's kind of easier to identify the genre of literature as a cycle if you're sort of using hindsight to see that this happens again and again and again. Is that how you would characterize?
That's a really good insight there. It doesn't feel like a cycle while you're in it. But I think that's the power of once you realize that it is. So then, everything looks bleak right now in the world. It does. And it seems like the cups, the bowls of judgment are being poured out upon us all. So then to be able to keep turning through the book of Revelation to get to the part where death itself, hell itself is thrown into the pit of fire and destroyed. And then every knee bows and every tongue confesses, and all things are made new, and there's streams of living water. And to be able to get to that point is there's some comfort in that.
Well, it seems like I want to go back to that series for a minute, if that's all right, the Left Behind series, that you talked about, Zach, it being kind of a way, at least I think this is what you were saying, a way of it almost, it seems to me that the way it was written was to help people relate to it, right? And then see that they'll be saved at the end and those types of things. And that's a very overgeneralization, I guess. But it's interesting while reading more about the series, the efforts to turn them into films, and how they keep trying to reboot it. And they're actually in the process of doing that now, of redoing the series again to see if they could get more attention to it, I guess, and to get more people on board this particular series. And I just find that fascinating, of what it is they seem to be trying to do. And part of me will be curious to see how will they try to connect, or will they try to connect it politically right? In some way that, so I remember in 2011 or something, I guess it was when Obama was running the second time. I think that was right. Yeah. Chuck Norris and his wife came out talking about that election, and that proclaimed that if Obama won re-election, it would begin the 1,000 years of darkness. If he won.
It's so dramatic.
Like, oh my gosh.
That's the thing. It's like that is a political strategy because it works, because it's got high drama, and it's like, the religious affiliation of these stories, they're all encompassing, and it just moves people. And yes.
The fact that people think that this is the worst that humanity has ever been blows my mind. Like, have you read history? We used to murder people for sport. We're not.
Yeah.
This is not so bad. Things are not as bad as you think they are.
Yeah. But it's just fascinating how they a percentage of the population kind of latches onto that messaging. And they're a powerful group of people, because especially when you talk about politics, they vote, you get them to vote. And that's how a lot of times some of the bigger elections they win, is because people know that if we can get the more fundamentalist, Christian and evangelical Christians out to vote, that most likely they'll vote for the Republican candidate, and they go out in numbers that can help. And so by tying in that argument that they use, obviously didn't work because Obama won a second term. But I just found that so interesting that was a perspective they were trying to use as a way to encourage people to vote, is if you don't vote for Romney, then the 1,000 years of darkness will begin.
Evangelicals going, if you don't vote for the Mormon, then the 1,000 years of darkness, right? Yeah. Which, that's not a personal knock against Mormons, but just those same evangelicals would not consider a Mormon a Christian normally. But
I remember that was a big conversation.
Scared. How do you come back from that, by the way? Like, once you've gone totally nuclear, that the world is going to end and Satan himself will reign if this man gets elected, like, how do you then say something about someone else? Like, there's no higher... You can't go higher than that. You've already gone nuclear. So
can't get worse than the Antichrist.
Right? What do we do
now? Yeah. But it just seems like such an interesting way to live. And as I said, the fact they're trying to redo this series again, and they're using the actor Kevin Sorbo, who did Hercules, right? No.
Yes. And then every low-budget Christian movie since then.
Yep. And he is someone who the right has, latched onto, and he's found his niche, and so he's going to star and direct in the new movie.
I will only watch it if Lucy Lawless is in it as well, as Xena Warrior Princess, not as anyone else.
Yeah, doubtful it'll happen, but that would be cool.
A man can dream.
That's right. Anyway, sorry, I know I keep going on that tangent, but I just found that fascinating.
I didn't know that. I didn't realize that they were trying to reboot the...
And this is from last month.
Okay. Well, there you go. So I was, talking through this, the shapes of time, kind of our plan for today's recording with my husband Chad, and he told me of a helpful kind of connection that might be familiar to many of you, but there is a piece. Well, first of all, there's a writer. He was an American writer, Kurt Vonnegut, who recorded, I think it's kind of like a short lecture, but also published in several places about his early writing, I think it was his thesis on the shapes of stories. And so I think that's a really interesting kind of connection here as we're talking about the shapes of time. Are we really just talking about the shapes of stories? And Kurt Vonnegut had this whole sort of charting out of different shapes of stories. And so, he was like writing and publishing. He has like a lot of novels and was thinking about like the structure of a narrative. And I think you can find, his lecture online. I think it's like a 30-minute piece. But, he talks through how, when you're talking about like any kind of genre of story, there's like this stair-step ladder where you're climbing upward. Things are going swimmingly. The lovers, they fall in love and they're like having a grand time, and they're, giving each other flowers and walking, holding hands through the park. And then something happens, and the stair-step ladder going upwards suddenly crashes into a desolate trough. And that trough, there's this low point, and then you have a low point that requires a creative solution, and then you start moving up on the incline again. And, maybe it flattens out. There's a plateau, and then maybe there's like a deeper crash, a deeper trough. And then the end of the story can maybe resolve coming again out of the trough back up into an incline that just keeps going up and up and up, and you have like your happy ending. I'm doing some heavy like paraphrasing of this shapes of stories. It's not something I had seen of his before, but like the point being that you can draw on like the same way that in my classes I draw like this circle and horizontal line to represent time. Kurt Vonnegut, there's like a bunch of different shapes, but you can put up on the board variations of these shapes too. You can have the staircase that goes up and then crashes down and then rises back up again. You can have something that looks more like a wave that bounces up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down and just has, twists and turns. And you can have a story that's just maybe it is a single horizontal line, and it's maybe a boring story where there's just nothing happens and it's just plateau from beginning to end. And there are like shapes of stories that we are drawn to. And why are we drawn to those stories? Why would we prefer a story that has the, peaks and valleys versus a story that's just a flat plateau all the way through? Is there, an excitement that comes with different shapes of stories? And why do we crave certain kinds of resolution at the end of a story? And it just is like, I think, a really interesting and kind of perfect like frame that Vonnegut sort of offered that I think really maps onto the way that we think about these like big conceptions of time out of our cultural religious lenses. And that it seems that we crave order, we crave orderliness in the midst of, seeming chaos, that we want to feel like we have control. We want to feel a sense of meaning. And so, I think like one way to sort of put these shapes of time or shapes of stories and bring them together is that that's part of what's being offered to us. And, for better or worse, because these shapes are different and they mean different things to different people. But I think the motivation of latching on to certain stories is that sort of comfort that and like sense of belonging that we derive from particular shapes. So I don't know. I'm curious what y'all think about that.
It reminds me of the end of the Gospel of Mark, which, Mark was written in the style of a Greek epic, which they don't all have perfect happy endings. And the earliest manuscripts, it ends with, the women come to the tomb, they find that it's empty. There's an angel who's like, hey, check it out. He's not here. He's gone. He's risen. Hallelujah. And it ends with, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's how the book ends. But that only lasted like a couple hundred years, because then people added on to the end of it. And so all of the later manuscripts and like the ones that are like King James was based on, the Latin Bibles, they all have this other 11 verses. That's all like wrapping up the story, like the end of The Lord of the Rings, where it's like, all right, well, then he appeared to 2 more of them, and then he appeared to everyone, and then he said, go into all the world and preach the gospel, and then he said, I love you, I'm happy, I'll see you later, I left lunch in the fridge, and everything got wrapped up in the end. And it was like they could not stand for the story to not end on a high note, that it had to end there, or else they just felt weird about it.
I love that as an example, because it's like you go from a story shape that kind of trails off at the end in this sad sort of dangling, like downward slope of trembling and fear, to like the sharp upward incline of happiness and resolution. It's very different emotional responses too.
The last chapter of Ecclesiastes does the same thing, where it's like some later editor was like, this needs a pick me up at the end. People are going to finish this and just be upset. So we need like a happy ending tacked on to the end
with a bow on it,
right? And then they did the same thing to I Am Legend. Anybody ever see that?
Mm-hmm.
The book, the short story ends totally differently. It ends with this great like Twilight Zone-esque reveal, and it's like dark, and it just ends. But Hollywood was like, we can't do that. We have to have a resolution. We have to have some kind of happy ending. People have to leave the theater feeling good in some way, shape, or form. Like they didn't just waste their time.
When you think about with storytelling, as we've already said, that having that nice ending is what human nature is what we want, right? We want to be able to wrap up something type deal. And so, John, my son John, and I are right now watching the Marvel Cinematic Universe in release order. And so he came, maybe a month or so ago, he was just like, hey, Dad, my friend watched Black Widow. I want to see Black Widow. And I said, okay, that's great, but we've not seen any of the others. It's not going to you're going to miss some things.
Oh, yeah.
I said, what, are you ready to start watching these? And he's like, oh, yeah, absolutely. So we started and we were watching in order of release, not chronological order. And so it makes me think about, he and I were talking the other day, and yesterday he was kind of trying to make sense of how they're all connected. We've gotten all the way through phase 2. We just started Civil War last night. Captain America Civil War, right? And he was talking about how they're all connected and stuff like that, but are they really like Captain America? The second one, is it really a sequel, and what that means, and part 1, part 2. And it made me think about Avengers, the 3rd and 4th one, right? Mm-hmm. So Infinity War, the way it ends, and then you have Endgame, and it was kind of pitched as a part 1, part 2 aspect of things, because part 1 does not end all happy-go-lucky as part 2 does. At least it ends where things are more wrapped up. Part 1 ends with a major cliffhanger, right? And you think about films like that, like, for example, the last 2 Harry Potter movies, for book 7. They were both the Deathly Hallows, but it was part 1, part 2. Part 1 did not end on a high note as part 2 did. And so it ended with something that you're just kind of like, well, what? And so, but you knew a part 2 was coming. So the story wasn't over yet, is my point. Right. Yeah. And we love it for the story to be over and happy, as you said. And I think the 2 examples you gave from scripture is just fascinating. I was not quite aware that they did that with Ecclesiastes, but I did know that that's how Mark changed, is that here was the original version, and then they added on some things to it, which I've always found really interesting. And to me, I always take that as, what does that say about the Bible? Right? And those types of things. But anyway.
Most people want to believe that things are going to work out well for them. And when we are in a storyline, we put ourselves in that story. And, we then want the characters to come out on top. Unless you are a person who is just super pessimistic, somebody like I don't know, Adam, who picked out Pan's Labyrinth for his movie early last year.
Sucked.
And that movie that movie ends, spoiler alert, with like a dead child. And it's like, oh, that's an awful ending. You know, or something like Requiem for a Dream that just ends with awful tragedy. Some people like that, and I don't know why, honestly.
Yeah.
I think it's like, I think some of those stories can be really cathartic. Like, it's not that they're happy, but they reflect something that you experience. And I think, like, the cathartic experience of watching something that's super, super sad, I think what that gives people to some extent is a feeling that you're not alone in experiencing, like, deep sadness or trauma, and that there's, like, a path. I mean, I guess if the story ends in, you know, death, I'm not sure. That maybe is a different message. But some of the stories that are really sad, there's still kind of a way forward through healing. And the healing is really hard and not, you know, it's not like a simple, straightforward, like wrapped up in a bow type of process. And it's just, I think there's something that's comforting in seeing that being reflected in all its like ugliness and darkness, that it kind of counterintuitively facilitates a kind of healing or a feeling of being seen. But that's a very different kind of story, like, I think, than, you know, what we've been talking about with the sort of nice resolution that is happy. But it's a different shape with a different kind of purpose, I think. And then there's also the kind of, you know, like storytelling problem where people don't want the story to end. And so the story just like drags on and on and on. Like if you think of like a TV show that is like 10 seasons too long. And it's like, why didn't you just have a plan to do this well in 3 seasons?
Are you talking about anything in particular?
Grey's Anatomy.
On and on and on and on and on and on and on.
We gave that up a long time ago.
But yeah, like, why? What's the kind of motivation of that shape? And I think it's like related to the desire to want things to work out well in the end. But I think people also want to keep experiencing that like happy moment or resolution, and to like feel part of a story for as long as possible, when, you know, really, like, all stories, they do come to an end, or they at least change over time. And so there's like, I think we all kind of have an impulse or like motivation to find like permanence in like goodness, or permanence in like stability. And that can like influence the way that we tell stories, and sort of drag them on in hopes that we can be part of them for longer.
Well, and so if I can, we talk about, you know, the feeling of happiness and just feeling good. You know, John and I, in this journey of watching all these films together, and we're having a great time doing it. You know, he's really getting into it, and we're having a lot of fun. But I remember sometimes he would talk to me about what was your favorite one, and, you know, your least favorite, and blah, blah, blah. And I had told him that, you know, we're not done with Civil War yet. We're going to finish it today. But that when I saw that film, I didn't want to watch it again. Like that, even though, you know, the way it ends, it's okay. It was still you know, for what, over 12 films or something like that so far up to that point, it's like all the heroes, maybe they don't get along at times, but they're still kind of on the same side. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you see in this one that, wait a minute, 2 of the biggest characters are now on opposite sides fighting each other. And I struggled with that. I got to be honest, watching that. That was tough to watch, because it made me sad. Yeah. And like, oh, this is something I'm supposed to be able to just escape into and not worry and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden this happens. And so that was tough. And so I like how they worked with it later. But that is interesting to me, how, you know, so watching it, some of it last night, I'm glad we're doing it. But even he was describing this morning, I said, so what do you think so far? And he's like, I like it, but I mean, it's really good and the plot's interesting, but I also don't like it because, and we've not gotten to the big fight yet. We stopped right before that. And, well, we had to because bedtime. Because I knew if we got into the fight, we'd have to watch the rest of the film, right? And so I said, we'll finish it today. But he just was like, but I don't like the fact that they're starting to not really get along. Because we both love Iron Man and Captain America, right? And but all these characters, you get attached to all of them. And so it's just interesting how this all relates. So.
Yeah, superhero movies in general kind of have the same shape as the New Testament, where it's like,
yeah.
Well, which is like,
paint us a shape, Zach.
I will.
Yeah.
I will paint you a picture auditorially.
Yes, please.
So they all begin with humble origins, an underdog story of somebody with great promise and potential who needs to go through a hero's journey in order to find their full potential. They discover their powers. They go up against the powers that be. There's some small successes. There's some small losses. And then there's the big confrontation in which they lose. They always have to lose, at least somewhat. They need to be beaten into the ground. Oh no, Iron Man is falling out of the sky because he's all frozen, and Captain America's shield is broken. Like you need to be broken in some way. But then, when all hope seems lost, look on the horizon, and there's, I know that's Gandalf coming over Helm's Deep, but
that was really good too, though.
Same kind of deal, right? Then there's this dramatic resurrection, and then boom, there we are. There's the happy ending that death is no more. Oh, death, where is thy sting? Oh, grave, where is thy victory? We have this final win. And then the same cycle repeats again with the early church in the book of Acts. And then we get through these letters. And then the book of Revelation does the exact same story arc of this humble beginnings and then these troughs. And then at the end, there's this great victory. And it always ends on a happy note. And all of the stories in the New Testament follow that same underdog hero's journey sort of story arc.
Shapes.
Which is maybe why I like superhero movies. I don't know.
Yeah.
It all comes together.
Well, it makes me think about The Matrix as well. Right? We're recording this less than a week before the fourth Matrix film comes out. Mm-hmm. Matrix Resurrections. And I think that's going to be really interesting. I mean, I'm actually excited about it. I really liked the series. I had issues with the second and third movie. But I still liked the storyline and the what it stood for and stuff. I thought was very interesting. But that's kind of like a superhero movie or series, as you just described, right? Mm-hmm. And also even like with Star Wars and the three separate trilogies.
Yeah,
right. They all kind of follow that same description that you just gave us about superhero movies, and so. Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting how they bring all that together in this fourth movie of the Matrix series.
I don't know.
Speaking of shapes and superheroes and the Bible, Zach, do you want to tell us about a Dead Christian Story Hour? How's that for a transition?
That is a wonderful transition because I still don't have a theme song.
Let's try to workshop that.
Okay.
Dead Christian Story Hour. Do you want something spooky, or like uplifting, or like Halloween theme music type of intro?
I don't know.
Something that's going to make me believe.
I'm kind of into the sort of ironic theme music, something chipper and cheery, like a mattress company jingle.
Oh,
right?
Yes, that's perfect. And you got to have some claps in there.
800-588-2300. Empire. That kind of. Right.
Yes. Love that.
Well, welcome to part 2 of the Dead Christian Story Hour, a part at the end of every 5th episode in which I share with you one of my favorite stories from Christian hagiography. What is hagiography, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. These are stories of dead Christians, and they are most of the time totally over the top. And I want you to take all of these with a giant grain of salt because they are not historically accurate and they aren't meant to be. They are stories of heroes. And so that's what they're just meant to be. So just let them be hero stories, okay? And stop thinking too much about it because it's great and I love them. This one comes from St. Lawrence. And St. Lawrence is the name of the borough where I live, which is named not at all after the actual St. Lawrence, but after a brand of stockings that the local knitting mill made in the 40s. But St. Lawrence... capitalism, right? It's too bad because it's a great story. And this is the only dead Christian whose icon I own. I have St. Lawrence in my kitchen. He holds my my coffee scoops. And I'll tell you why in just a second, because it's great. So I'm going to take you all the way back to the mid-250s. So this is like 200 years after Jesus. And Christianity is still kind of an underground sort of deal. But Christians in Rome were starting to get maybe a little bit too powerful, a little bit too influential. The whole thing was just kind of like blech to Emperor Valerian. He wasn't really having a whole lot of these Christians. So he issued an edict that all Christians in Rome must offer a sacrifice to Roman gods or else lose their titles and land and standing, and anyone who persisted should be put to death. This was something that Roman emperors did from time to time because they knew that Christians weren't going to do it, because Christians were stubborn, and they were, in those days, kind of countercultural pacifistic anarchists who loved to give the middle finger to the government. If you can imagine such a thing, that's what the church was like back then. And they were not, under any circumstance, going to acknowledge a Roman god as any kind of god, because they were like, it's Jesus or nothing. Sorry, I'll die before I'll do that. And so the Romans were like, great, then we'll kill you. So in 258, the Emperor Valerian issued an edict that all of the bishops, priests, and deacons of the Roman Church should immediately be put to death and all of their treasures confiscated, because obviously they would not make those sacrifices to Jupiter and such. So they started hunting down all the church leaders. And after they killed the Pope and some of the most prominent leaders, the prefect of Rome went after the archdeacon of the church and demanded that he turn over all the treasures of the church. Now, deacons, for those of you who are not super into churchy stuff, are the class of officers within the church who are tasked with feeding and taking care of the poor and the widows, the orphans, the lepers, anyone who has no social safety net in society. The deacons were the ones who went out and found these people and took care of them and helped them. So indirectly, they're also the people in charge of whatever finances the church has, which at those times was not a whole lot, but that was their job. And this fellow named Lawrence was the first deacon appointed of this church, and he was kind of in charge. So the Roman prefect went to him, and they were like, hey, Lawrence, so I got to kill you. And I'm sorry about that, but I got to do it. However, if you turn over all of the treasures of the church to me right now, I might give you a head start so you can get out of Dodge. Right, because the prefect wants to take a cut before he gives the rest to the emperor. So he's trying to make it a little sweet for himself. So Lawrence is like, all right, sure, I'm in. Give me 3 days. And at this point, I'm sure the prefect is like, wait a second. What? These Christians, they're jackasses. So why is this guy on board? But whatever. I'm not gonna think too hard about it. I'm gonna get some cash money. So 3 days later, Lawrence shows up in front of the prefect's office, and trailing him is a crowd of the dirtiest people the widows, the orphans, the lepers, the poor, the crippled, the sick, following behind him in this crowd. And he says to the prefect, "Behold, the treasures of the church." Yeah. Because he had taken those 3 days and had liquidated all of the church's assets and had then just redistributed them to the poor in Rome. So the church had no money after that. And he said, "We are far more wealthy than your emperor will ever be." So as you can probably guess, the prefect was not a fan. And so instead of beheading him, as they did with the Pope and everyone else, he's like, "I'm going to make this guy suffer." So he strapped him to a gridiron and put him over a bed of hot coals to slowly cook him to death. And after a while of excruciating pain, he said to Lawrence, "What do you have to say for yourself now?" And Lawrence looked at him and he said, "I'm done on this side. Turn me over." And for that, they made him the patron saint of cooks. And so the icon I have of him in my kitchen is of him happily standing there with this big smile on his face, holding a big gridiron with like a bunch of garlic and onions in his other hand, as if he was like the church chef, because he's the patron saint of cooks. And somebody told the icon maker, "Go ahead and make me a picture of St. Lawrence, the patron saint of cooks." And they're like, "Yeah, sure, I'll give him a bunch of food and stuff," because apparently he was a chef. He was not a chef. He was cooked alive on a gridiron. He is also the patron saint of comedians, which feels a lot more appropriate because dude was a smartass. And
I love that.
I kind of love him.
The patron saint of chefs, even though he was cooked alive.
Yeah. The patron saint of dentists also got her teeth kicked out. So the people who come up with these things have a sort of sense of cruel irony, I think.
Yeah, very much so.
I would say so.
Yeah.
I love that. Is there like a closing, like outgoing theme music that we'll have for this bit too? Because I feel like it really needs that.
Oh, well, maybe someday.
Nothing about magical breasts this time, though.
No magical breast this time. Just a smart alecky deacon who got cooked alive and then later turned into the patron saint of yummy garlic and onions.
Yeah. That was, yeah.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay.
So the next time you're having
stuff.
a barbecue, pour one out for St. Lawrence and maybe give the middle finger to the government. That's what he would want.
To St. Lawrence for being cooked alive.
There you go.
Thank you.